Namaskar. On behalf of the Raza Foundation, I, the Managing Trustee, called Ashok Vajpayee, welcome you this morning. One of the things in which Syed Haidar Raza, the great painter who created this foundation and endowed it, he was very keen about ideas. But more importantly, he was also keen about the ideas of the younger people rather than celebrities and the well-established. So he always used to say, let us do something about the young people. So we started doing a series of activities which are aimed at the young in classical music, in classical dance, in visual arts. And this now is an important initiative in the realm of ideas. And we have called it Vichar Vinod. In our tradition, ideas are supposed to be enjoyed, apart from anything else. And the ideas need not be somber and long-faced and so complex as to be completely incomprehensible, etc. So the idea of Vinod was to enjoyment of ideas. And we hope that this will become an annual event. There is of course a kind of a contradiction. We have said कि आखिर सवाल क्या है और कई सवाल पूछ दिए. So I mean, you are of course free to say no, this is not the question. You have a large number of people who come and instead of speaking on the theme, they say this is the wrong theme. So I used to interrupt and say, my dear, you have been invited to speak on this theme. If this is the wrong theme, that you need not come. But you are free, however, to say what you want to say. Now, ideas at the moment are under great assault. In fact, all knowledge is, unfortunately, but all the institutions which can possibly be generating ideas are under some kind of curb or restraint or constraint or whatever. Whether they are universities and other institutions. And a kind of a psychosis is being built, and this is not merely in India but across the world, that world can be changed by things rather than by ideas. So ideas seem to have been replaced in some sense by things, and there is such a surfeit of things that you hardly have time to think. The times are of course very violent. These are bloody times, and murder and killing is in the air, and ideas are almost being criminalized. At least dissent is being criminalized, as you know. That if you don't agree with the current psychosis of whatever, you can be charged of sedition, etc. So, and there is a growing amnesia, as if other ideas have never existed, as if other ways of looking at the world have not existed, as if in a democracy only one view can prevail just because that view, even though, let's say in our case, voted by only 32% of the population, is the view which has to prevail, and that view must be implemented all across. Now, we have had a long tradition. In fact, it was famously said at one time by Orientalists that in India no single idea was ever allowed to dominate. If at all a new idea came up, a counter idea is also encouraged to come up. And therefore we have been a civilization which had promoted, discovered a plurality of ideas. And today one of my friends yesterday called, we need a neighborhood of ideas. And this is what we are attempting in a modest, small way. You're going to have questions, themes relating to democracy, religion, truth, communication, caste, Muslim, citizenship, communication, etc. And there are many, many questions that you will be facing. I want to read out in the end a short poem by Shrikant Verma, who wrote it in, I think, 1984. And it says, कौशल में विचारों की कमी है. महाराज बधाई हो, महाराज की जय हो, युद्ध नहीं हुआ, लौट गए शत्रु. वैसे हमारी तैयारी पूरी थी. 4 अक्षौहिणी से थी सेनाएं, 10 सहस्र अश्व, लगभग इतने ही हाथी. कोई कसर न थी. युद्ध होता भी तो नतीजा यही होता. न उनके पास अस्त्र थे, न अश्व, न हाथी. युद्ध हो भी कैसे सकता था, निहत्थे थे वे. उनमें से हर एक अकेला था और हर एक ये कहता था प्रत्येक अकेला होता है. जो भी हो, जय यह आपकी है, बधाई हो, राजसूय पूरा हुआ, आप चक्रवर्ती हुए. ये सिर्फ कुछ प्रश्न छोड़ गए हैं, जैसे कि यह कौशल अधिक दिन टिक नहीं सकता, कौशल में विचारों की कमी है. थैंक यू वेरी मच.
बहुत शुक्रिया. जैसा अशोक वाजपेयी जी ने बताया कि ये 2 दिनों का विचार विमर्श का सिलसिला अब शुरू होता है और रज़ा फाउंडेशन और फाउंडेशन फॉर क्रिएटिव सोशल रिसर्च के दोनों ने मिलकर यह आयोजन किया है और इसमें आपको आमंत्रित किया है. इसकी रूपरेखा कुछ इस प्रकार है जो आपको पहले मिली होगी और वो यह है कि अभी के सत्र में प्रोफेसर नीरा चंदो एक प्रकार की प्रस्तावना प्रस्तुत करेंगी जो मुख्य विषय रखा गया है, आखिर सवाल क्या है उसके इर्द गिर्द. फिर पहला सत्र शुरू होगा, इज रिलीजन इन क्राइसिस. इसमें मनीषा सेठी इसकी अध्यक्षता करेंगी, संजय श्रीवास्तव, वलय और इरफानुल्लाह फारूकी इसमें वक्ता हैं. दूसरा सत्र कैन मुस्लिम स्पीक, गजाला जमील इसकी अध्यक्षता करेंगी, हुमा हसन, हेबा अहमद और आमिर अली इसमें वक्ता हैं. तीसरा सत्र इनहेरिशन ऑफ कास्ट ऑन द एजेंडा जिसकी अध्यक्षता सतीश देशपांडे करेंगे और इसमें वक्ता हरीश वानखेड़े, अनुपमा और मोहम्मद सज्जाद हैं. चौथा सत्र इज सिटीजनशिप ए लिमिटेड कॉन्सेप्ट जिसकी अध्यक्षता अनुपमा रॉय करेंगी और इसमें जो वक्ता हैं वे हैं प्रवीण प्रियदर्शी, उमर खालिद और अब्दुल कलाम आज़ाद. और कल दूसरे दिन हम 10 बजे से अपना सत्र शुरू करेंगे. पहला सत्र है डज ट्रुथ एग्जिस्ट और उसके अध्यक्षता ईश्वर सिंह दोस्त कर रहे हैं और उसके वक्ता मुजफ्फर अली, सौरभ तुदारिया और परवेज आलम हैं. और दूसरा सत्र है इज डेमोक्रेसी फेसिंग टर्मिनल क्राइसिस और इसकी अध्यक्षता अजय गुड़ावर्दी करेंगे और इसके वक्ता हैं सार्थक बागची, लोनी मिताई और सुची भारती. दोपहर के सत्र हैं 7वां इज कम्युनिकेशन इम्पॉसिबल जिसकी अध्यक्षता प्रोफेसर मनोज झा करेंगे और इसके वक्ता माधवी मेनन, रवीश कुमार और मनोज कुमार हैं. इसके बाद चाय के बाद आखिरी खुला सत्र होगा जिसमें हम सारे सत्रों में शामिल लोग एक दूसरे से खुलकर बातचीत कर सकेंगे. और कुछ मित्रों से हमने ये अनुरोध किया है कि वे सारे ही सत्रों में रहेंगे और अपनी टिप्पणी करेंगे. हमने प्रोफेसर सविता सिंह से आग्रह किया है और उनकी टिप्पणी हम आखिरी सत्र में सुनेंगे। प्रोफेसर मनोरंजन मोहंती को कुछ समय बाद यहाँ होना चाहिए इसी सत्र में, और उन्होंने वादा किया है कि वे सारे सत्रों में रहेंगे और आखिरी सत्र की अध्यक्षता करते हुए वे टिप्पणी करेंगे। तो यह पूरी योजना इस कार्यक्रम की है। हम प्रोफेसर नीरज चंदोक से अनुरोध करते हैं कि वे प्रस्तावना वक्तव्य दें।
Okay. Thank you for inviting me. A bit of an anachronistic phenomena in a meeting of young social scientists. Dorothy Lessing has a very interesting piece on growing old. And she says, a young person asked me, what is it like to be old? So she said, I never thought about it, but I started thinking. And then in the end she says, so I don't care, I've grown old, I've seen many things happening and not happening in my life. So I wear my bathing costume, I go to the beach, and young women look at me with contempt and disdain, but I don't care, they too will grow old. So in the meantime, pass me a piece of that chocolate cake. So please see me as somebody, as a teacher who has always focused on the fact that she must teach her students how to ask questions. I have no answers, but the one thing you can do to your student is to arouse curiosity in their mind. Okay, this is a very preliminary formulation of something I've been thinking of working on when the time comes, and basically it is what is Swaraj. I don't know when I'll get down to it, but this is very preliminary. Okay, because come back to Swaraj, it doesn't mean the same from Tilak, Dadabhai, Naroji to Savarkar to Gandhi to Ambedkar and to various Congress resolutions, and uncomfortably many of Gandhi, people who have worked on Gandhi's concept of Swaraj, the concept lands up like Isaiah Berlin's positive liberty, and Isaiah Berlin's positive liberty was a synonym for totalitarianism. So it's a little worrying about what exactly does Swaraj mean, considering we have a political party called Swaraj. We also have the Chief Minister of Delhi writing a whole book on Swaraj, but I've not been able to figure out what Swaraj is. If anybody can help me by the end of this presentation, I will be very grateful. Okay, we are aware that any academic investigation has to begin with a research question. Now, whether that question is good or bad is another debate altogether. I'm not going to go into it. What I am concerned with is a prior question that stalks the whole process of asking a question and beginning your research from there. What are the historical, political, and academic influences that shape the question itself? Because if we look at the history of ideas, history of political ideas in our case, we find that questions are more or less situated in an academic, intellectual tradition. The answers are different. Plato's notion of substantive justice was very different from Rawls's notion of procedural justice, but they both asked a question, what is justice? In a way, we have to ask, when does a new question arise? And this is also a bit debatable, because maybe we have no new question. These are old wisdoms clothed in new words. But there are occasionally questions that disrupt intellectual traditions, that destabilize intellectual tradition. At a random example, Foucault's question. He posed an important question. It was problematic, but he posed a question. Till now, political philosophers have asked, what kind of society does an individual need? Suppose I ask the question, what kind of an individual does society need? Now, in a way, this is not a new question, because the Frankfurt School of Critical Theorists had been asking questions about social oppression. Gramsci had focused upon what Foucault was later to call micropolitics, but it did destabilize the intellectual tradition and led to an entire movement which was called postmodernism, and then in our context, postcolonialism. I thought postcolonialism was an important movement. It's kind of peaked and passed, but we have to understand the historical significance of ideas. It was an important movement because it focused on two things. It focused on A, decolonization of knowledge, and B, recovering an indigenous tradition. And many scholars set out to actually recapture an indigenous tradition, which is itself a problematic example. Problematic project, I would say. Because A, there is no homogeneous Western tradition, and B, the notion of an Indian tradition, as I will try to show, is ridden with dilemmas. The question of recovering an indigenous tradition and therefore an indigenous self, a collective self that is truly free from the petty and major tyrannies of colonialism, is, however, a complex one. And I want to draw out the implications of this complexity by referring to a rather famous lecture given in 1928 by a philosopher, Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya, KCB, who was George V Professor of Philosophy at Calcutta University. He got it late in life because the first time the chair was up, Radhakrishnan got it, and Radhakrishnan was an archetypical Orientalist philosopher. But it's very difficult because still today when Supreme Court has to talk about secularism or religion, they go back to Radhakrishnan. And Radhakrishnan never asked a question which Western Orientalists had any problem with. KCB did. Now KCB, speaking to a group of students at Higley College, posed the question thus: Swaraj in ideas, ? KCB begins his argument by exploring intellectual decolonization. He spoke in a way that was to be captured by Frantz Fanon later. He spoke of domination of man by man, except that he said this domination is so subtle and it's so imperceptible. We do not even realize that we are gripped by a shadow spirit. We can't even struggle against domination, because if domination is open, you struggle against it. That is the nature of humankind. But not to perceive domination is an evil because it sinks into our soul. And then he says something rather important. He said this subjection is slavery of the spirit, and when a person can shake himself free from it, he feels as though the scales have fallen from his eyes. This is Swaraj in ideas. Now at the very beginning of the presentation, you see how he defines Swaraj, and that's part of the complexity of the concept as opposition to subjection. We still don't know what Swaraj is. Now scales must fall from our eyes, went on to argue KCB, because actually colonialism has paralyzed the Indian mind. We have had a century of contact with vivifying ideas of European culture and European civilization, and not a single Indian contribution, he went on to argue, has been made to theatre, to poets, to philosophy, to anything which would actually reflect our own tradition. All we have done, we haven't even interpreted Shakespeare in our own tradition of Natya Shastra. Indian scholars have failed to use Indian epistemologies to contribute to aesthetics or to drama or to philosophy. And this is really sad, he goes on to say, because it is in philosophy that we can see a coming together of Western and Indian ideas. It is in philosophy, I quote, if anyway that the task of discovering the soul of India is imperative for modern India. Genius can uncover the soul of India in art, but it is through philosophy that we can methodologically attempt to discover it. But even if we were to attempt this, discover the soul of India through philosophy, through recapturing our own philosophy, how do we go about it? Now here it's very interesting. From Swaraj, KCB moves on to the idea of a kind of cosmopolitanism. He says we must not reject Western ideas if they are relevant. There are many Western ideas we do not need to engage with. They are irrelevant for us because each idea is a product of its own soil, of its own culture, of its own tradition. But if you find an idea that is relevant to us, then we must proceed to translate the idea but into our own idiom. It's a little perplexing because that would really mean that we, for example, discover Kant through Gandhi instead of the other way around, because Kant was chronologically earlier than Gandhi. But he insists that we have to, in fact, meet somewhere and confront these true traditions, and when we proceed to work out patiently, systematically and methodologically the similarities between these two traditions, we will have some kind of universalism. So it's not as if universalism is opposed to particularism, but a case can be made for universalism, which is vital for humanity. We have to have humility and patience, and he makes a very interesting comment. He said the Guru must be respected irrespective of his community. We must respect the Guru. What is universal is only the spirit, the loyalty to our own ideals and the openness to other ideals, the determination not to reject them. Because if you reject foreign ideals, these are all Western, then you land up with national conceit or with racism. But how do we approach our own ideas? We must respect other ideas if we found them meaningful for our own tradition, but we must approach our own tradition with reverence. Now, in a way, he was arguing that foreign languages can only be understood when we express them in our own way. He pleads for a genuine translation of foreign ideas into the Indian tradition. Let us, he says, think in our own concepts. So there's respect for a foreign tradition, but reverence for others. So he shows a certain openness, but at the same time, he continues to insist there must be reverence. Now, KCB was not given much importance during the colonial period. In most standard definitions of Swaraj or discussions of Swaraj, you really don't come across KCB. But in 1984, there was a special edition of the Indian Philosophical Review, which was edited by Sharad Deshpande, philosopher who lives in Pune, and a whole range of philosophers began to examine KCB Swarajian ideas from the point of view of 1984, and that was modernity versus tradition. That was a big debate in the 1980s. And there are two kinds of debates I want to take up to really illustrate the problems in the whole phrase reverence for our own tradition. The first question, they both all agree that KCB's critique of the colonization of the mind and intellectual slavery is well taken. We continue to suffer from it right now, till today. But how do you meet it? By rejecting it? And that you cannot, because it's very, very difficult to extricate a tradition when you have undergone colonialism for more than 200 years. And when Western scholars and Indologists have actually translated your texts for you. Most of us read these texts in the English language from Bhagavad Gita onwards. The first critique is, however, given by a philosopher called Dharminder Goel. He says, what strand of the Indian spirit should we show reverence for? This is a very, Ashok Vajpayee spoke of the plurality of the Indian tradition. Or if we are plural, then what strand of the Indian tradition do we show reverence for? Is it medieval eroticism? Is it the poetry of Guru Gobind Singh? It is the love poetry of Baba Farid? Is it paintings in Khajuraho and Konark? What is the tradition? And the critique is well taken, because then Goel goes on to say that though he focuses on intellectual colonialism very well, KCB has various blind spots. He indiscriminately sleepwalks through the long and hoary spiritual tradition and cultural identity of Indian society, and blandly affirms its unique character. It is so unique that you must understand Western tradition through the eyes of Indians. Whose ideals? Those of Vedic Sanskrit Pandits? Are these the ideals all of us subscribe to? Now, in a way, you have to understand Goel's focus on the problematic nature of the Indian tradition when we start remembering the critiques of the way a public philosophy came to shape the Indian nationalist discourse in the 19th century. It was metaphysical, Sanskritic, Brahmanic, and very upper caste. Now, it was probably due to the fact that most literary theorists, and this became the domain of the transformation of English literature. It was not only colonialism that did it. It was not only the selection of a very highly metaphysical textual tradition that was taken to be the norm, the canon, and which was adopted uncritically by nationalists, and you don't blame them, because when they set up philosophy departments in Bengal, they were all dominated by Kantians and Hegelians. They were all products of our university. When political science started being taught in the 1930s in India, they only dealt with the idealist tradition, T.H. Green, Bosanquet. So they were products. They took up uncritically an intellectual debate which began in Bengal with Raja Ram Mohan Roy, which came to Maharashtra and was annexed to the nation-state project. And what was the public philosophy? Vedanta. But if you read a philosopher like J.N. Mohanty, who I think is one of the most lucid philosophers, it's so easy to understand Indian philosophy through J.N. Mohanty's eyes. Now, J.N. Mohanty says the Vedas themselves, when they were, condensed in 2000 BCE, care was taken to exclude any philosophy that went against Vedantic principles. So a rationalist philosophy like Samkhya is excluded. A materialist philosophy like Charvak is excluded. Buddhism, Jainism, they are all excluded, notwithstanding the fact that ahimsa comes into Indian traditions after Buddhism made its way as a critique of Vedanta. This narrowing of Indian philosophy, it often strikes me, suppose we had adopted Charvak as our materialist philosophy as our public philosophy in the 19th and 20th century, which Vivekananda interprets, Gandhi interprets, everybody, would we have been more sensitive to the inconsistencies and the oppressions of our own society? Rather than look at Vedanta, which gave us the firm self-confidence, we are a peace-loving nation, we are spiritual, the West is materialistic. The problem, nobody is materialistic as Indians. And we talk of war all the time. We are talking of war these days. How do we observe this vanity? We are a peace-loving people. Now, Charvak, Pradeep Gokhale has a wonderful book on Charvak, and he says, is a philosophy that gives you no foundational texts. It doesn't say abide by the Vedas. It says if you're a philosopher, you have to observe an attitude of critical inquiry into everything. So, public intellectuals in India joined the Orientalist slogan of a metaphysical, of a very highly spiritualized India without, the text and practice of Indian tradition was completely dislocated. First by Vedanta, then by the colonialists, then by our nationalist leaders. What was the impact of this upper caste Brahmanical ideology upon the oppressions of our own society, upon the so-called lower castes, upon women? Of course, issues were taken up, but it required Ambedkar to walk out of Hinduism for public intellectuals to take him seriously. He was not taken seriously. You had an atmosphere, Gandhi, despite the fact we all admire Gandhi was very patronizing. Caste system, leave it. You people reform. Because it's a part of our tradition. Now return to Goel, Dharminder Goel's critique. He says the panorama of India's past extending for more than 5 centuries cannot be articulated within the limits of the Sanskritic tradition, even if we add to the Vedas, the Dharam Shastras, the epics, poetics, classics, theatre, dramaturgy, Niti Shastra and social institutions. The ahimsa of medieval Brahmanical Vaishnavism is from Buddhism and other non-Aryan sources. The sexuality of Tantric Shaktism is derived from primitive oral traditions. Tribals carry Brahmanical texts in their oral myths. There is no homogeneity, no continuity in the Indian tradition, provided we stop subscribing to a homogenized dominating tradition that somebody like Shashi Tharoor writes of so uncritically in his Why I'm a Hindu. I had the onerous task of reviewing his book, Hindu Asked Me, and I can't say no to them. It was such an uncritical acceptance that we are Hindus. How do you deal with caste? Well, educated Hindus don't deal with caste. Right? You still have honor killings. So this glorious vanity we all live in is gradually due to all questions were asked within a dominant intellectual tradition. How do we live? How do we get rid of caste? Hindus should change, caste system ko rehne do. That is a problem of wondering what kind of questions we are asking. The great grammarian, philosopher and yogi Bhartihari of the classical period wrote, like Shankara, erotic and evocative lyrics, even as he advocates purity of desire and penance. This is Goel, not me. Staples of the tradition coming down from the Vedas. These are the staples. And Goel goes on to conclude, if one is burdened by tradition, one has to achieve Swaraj from it in order to achieve genuine Swaraj. You cannot reject other tradition and continue to be burdened by that tradition. The critique is taken up by Rajendra Prasad, a professor from Jaipur. And he refers to Anantamurti's Sanskara, right? Praneshcharya. Praneshcharya is a very sincere, erudite scholar steeped in tradition, but he is unable to deal with a complex moral situation. What do you do with the body of a renegade Brahmin? If anybody has read, I actually took that novel and read it, of course in English. Nobody cooks in that village because there's a dead body lying there. Plague hits the village, nobody can do anything. And they're still discussing what all his tradition, all his culture cannot help him how to solve this complex moral dilemma. The only time at which he starts asking a small question, when he actually sleeps with that woman who's supposed to be untouchable, and he says, why is she called untouchable? That is the only time he questions. He cannot figure out how to deal. This is a question of moral dilemmas, and I come to the final part of this presentation. You know, one's own tradition can just be enslaving as a foreign tradition if you do not take care to question it. Now suppose we were to see our tradition as a series of moral dilemmas, and nobody has pointed out more brilliantly than the late Bimal Martilal in his Ethics and Epics. He takes up a series of moral dilemmas from the Mahabharata, and one of this dilemma is very interesting, and then I have a couple of other dilemmas we wish to point out, and then we figure out what the implications are for the theme of this seminar. Bimal Martilal starts with a story from the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is one of those complex epics. There was a time when I suggested to the Vice Chancellor of Delhi University, let every student do a course in epics, Greek epics, Indian epics. So he said, why? I think it was Deepak Bengal. I said, commerce, science, engineering, so let them do the epics. So he said, they'll know life is very grey. Life is not one man answering, coming along with a hero and sorting all your problems. Life is grey and nobody wins, everybody loses. That's what Greek epics tell you, that is what Mahabharata tells you. Nobody loses. Yudhishthira walks around saying, what have I done? I don't want to rule. It takes a Krishna to tell him, go and talk to Bhishma and he'll tell you how to rule, and we have the Shanti Parva. You see, nobody has won. Now, the story that Bimal Martilal recounts is the following. He said there was a hermit called Kaushika, and he had committed that he will always tell the truth because he wanted to go to heaven. Gone. He points, they overtake the travelers, kill them, loot them, and Kaushika does not go to heaven. Bimal Martilal brings out the implications very well. That's why I keep quoting him, because I think one of the finest philosophers who never really got his due. He knew his tradition, he knew Kant, he was immersed in Kant. He says, see, there were two values which confront every human being, and these are a part of our tradition. One is ahimsa, the other is satya. Or one is satya, the other is ahimsa, and they are both equally important. This is not Kantian, the philosophy, where you have a series of priorities. Thou shalt treat the others as if they were you. The categorical imperative, I misquote. Yes, or the 10 Commandments. I've always wondered why the Supreme Court keeps saying secularism is sarab dharam sambhav, because to Christianity there are no different two paths to God. The first commandment is you shall obey no other God besides me. If you obey another God, that's blasphemy. Islam doesn't believe in different, but we keep saying sarab dharam sambhav, that's secularism, which I think is a very Hindu way of interpreting secularism in a multi-religious society. That is a moral dilemma. Now, you'll be able to tell me probably I can't figure out the difference between Dharam Sankat and Dharam Samasya. Philosophers keep using it in the same way. But I would imagine Dharam Sankat a little more difficult than a Dharam Samasya. The moral dilemma is you have two values. They're both equally important. They are both equally, you don't know which one to choose. You choose one, you reject the other. Now how do you obey both values? Bimal Bhattilal has an interesting answer which I will come back to, but let's go back to the Mahabharata and let's go to Yudhishthir, Dharamraj. Chitra Devakurni has a very interesting feminist novel called Palace of Illusion, speaking from Draupadi's perspective. And she's, who did Draupadi love? She couldn't love Yudhishthir. He was such a wimp. He kept saying, should I go this way or that way? Main idhar jaun ke udhar jaun. He could never make up his mind. She could have loved Arjun. Arjun loved Subhadra. And Bhim loved her, but nobody could really love Bhim. So she said she only loved Karna. And in the end, she's very touchingly seen where, women are always kind of cleaning up after a party. After the battle, women go looking for their dead and she goes looking for Karna's body. It's a very interesting point that Yudhishthir is seen as somebody who's a very Hamlet-like figure to do or not to do. But when he goes to the battlefield and says, Ashwathama, the elephant, is dead, he knows what the impact on Dronacharya was. He chooses his dharma as the commander of the armed forces over his lifelong commitment to Satya. And there are a number of pieces which say, why was he known as a Dharamraj? But still everybody went to him and saying, what is dharma? The man doesn't know what to do. He's responsible for the killing of Dronacharya. Dronacharya, I think, commits suicide. I'm not very sure what he does. But then Ashwathama goes and kills the entire second generation of Pandav. Then he is committed to wandering between heaven and hell. Look at the tragedies that unfold out of one untruth. It is deceit. Now, choosing between two values, Yudhishthir, this great Dharamraj, actually commits a series of murders because he's not ignorant, he knows. And when he knows and he willingly forswears the truth, he commits a crime. On the other hand, Bimal Bhattilal says, Kaushika could have been a little more intelligent. When the bandits asked him which way did they go, he could have kept quiet. Or he could have said, I know, but I will not tell you. So you shift to a neutral level and you upkeep both your commitments. But life is a series of moral dilemmas. Now what do you do with moral dilemmas? You can't solve them. A moral dilemma involves choosing between two courses of action which are recognized by the agent as equally obligatory, but which are mutually incompatible and which are irreconcilable. You choose one, you violate the other. So you have to use a great deal of imagination because there is no rational ground for choosing between the two. Yudhishthir was not being rational. He was being actually cynical. He was being deceitful. And I could never really understand the pedestal he is placed upon. Maybe you should adopt a third option. But that really reminds us that life is a series of what we call, there is no consistent morals. These are only situational ethics. You have to decide, and when you have to decide, you actually approach your tradition with a bit of humor, with a bit of skepticism, and a bit of irony. You don't see it as an answer, you just see it as life is a lesson. Life is now use your imagination, use your autonomy, and use your intellect to decide what to do. And that is what life is. Life is not neat. You can't resort. Otherwise, we land like Pranishcharya and not knowing what to do when there is a situation that is completely unprecedented. So in the end, as I said, this is just a project which is in the making. What is Swaraj? Maybe it's the capacity to think independently of our own tradition. Maybe it's the capacity not to revere, but to approach our own tradition with a certain degree of irony. I'm not talking about irony because that is a very complex philosophical issue and I'm not competent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Vichar Vinod, for enlightening speech on Mahabharata. I think I remember my good old days when I used to be in her class. And that time probably we were not so conscious about these traditions. when we were more bogged down with political economy and all. I think she has very rightly raised this question that we have right to raise questions, and we need not to be very sure of what is the question. Maybe we decipher what is the question, and in these difficult times in which we are living, probably this is the most important thing that we have to do, and that's why we thought that despite a lot of objections people raised, we thought this is a good idea to begin with this idea of what is the question. And particularly at the time when somebody told me doing my field work that an observer from outside, from a village, that the difference between Vishwavidyalaya and Sachivalaya is narrowing down. It's very difficult to decipher which is Vishwavidyalaya, which is Sachivalaya. Particularly if you have a tope and a big flag, it's very difficult to locate the building. So we thought that this kind of discussion would unfold a lot of things for what we call creative theory. And one of the things that Professor Chandok has really posed for us is how do we approach our tradition. Obviously we have to get out of the frenzy of identity politics and treat this as knowledge available, and then we have to approach democratically all knowledge traditions probably which can solve our problem. Can we also have a discussion around this paper, or you want to have it?
Kitna time?
Can we have some time? We have 10 minutes, so we can have some questions. We can take some questions. I think we must take this opportunity to ask her some questions, and I'll just make 2 points and then would like to ask for some questions. One, that this idea of Vichar Vinod at the time of, at difficult times is very interesting. And we were just discussing what is the Vinod means. Vinod is the entertainment, and entertainment, it depends what entertains you, whether poetry entertains you or a kind of movie which is being popular these days, that entertains you. So it depends on what. I'm sure that the involvement in raising question itself is very entertaining, and because this is the flow of energy that the brain does at this moment, is something that keeps us living. So this conference at the end of the day is not supposed to answer our questions, I guess, but probably it will be a movement towards that. In difficult times, raising question has become difficult, so finding out answers and standing with answers is much more difficult. Hopefully Swaraj means that we reclaim our right to philosophy, our right to questioning, our right to raise new questions, and our right to think as human beings. That is the idea of this conference. I would like to take some questions for her, and then.
I'm sorry, you guys will have to use a mic. I have a hearing problem. I'm not able to hear very clearly. So there is a mic here.
No, this is the recording mic.
Oh, it's the recording mic.
That Neera, whenever she talks and writes, she takes 2 or 3 approaches in her thinking and writing, and she creates a kind of intellectual ambiguity in which others will also have space. So the ambiguity is not to confuse, but to allow democratic philosophical space for people to choose their position, and she did exactly here what she has been doing. But I thought today she took a position when she said that the outcome of a reflection on tradition should be, not outcome, but the approach should be ironical, which is a Rotian position. This Richard Rorty upset the entire analytical tradition of Western thought through his own brand of mixing of pragmatism and postmodernism, and ultimately his most famous collection of essays, which is on irony basically, he opens up the way she has opened up, that none of the questions can be so ethically rooted that the answer would be almost predetermined. So I think, Neera, I would like to know, because I have known that you've had a lot of affection for liberal ideas, but this Rotian turn, which is almost postmodern now, is this the way to go for our own tradition as well? Will that solve our problem? I mean, will lightness solve the problem of heaviness that we are facing today? I mean, seriousness of the kind that people are being actually killed, people are being killed with certain justifications and moral positions, and it is not a secret anymore, it's an open thing. Either you are with our understanding or you are with the other. So that space itself, the liberal philosophical space, has shrunk quite a bit. Should we pose our questions in the same way that you have done? Because it presupposes, if you remember the discourse that took place between Rawls and Rorty and Charles Taylor, this was the issue. What is the space within which we should be asking questions? We should give us some answers, some endurable answer. It can't be so light. I mean, we can't make it so surface-like. Secondly, do you think that there is a way out for us? As Taylor also spoke about when he was talking about multiculturalism, that there is a space for what is known as contrastive rationality. That there is a space where we can still make not one or two, but 5, 6 arguments in favor of the position that we are taking.
You wanted to ask a question. We'll take 2 more and then
Take more questions.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I must, first of all, I'm very happy that you have come up with a new definition of Swaraj. Because unfortunately what has happened is that Swaraj has been, there is one trend, a major trend of understanding Swaraj is to at least straight away reduce it into decolonization. But that decolonization is taken way back into nativity. For example, there is a trend of interpretators who interpret KCB as being a front runner of nativity rather than cosmopolitanism. Your interpretation of Swaraj is for that interpretation of cosmopolitanism. And the latest one among the interpreters of Swaraj as decolonization is Akash Singh Rathore. He wrote a book, this Indian Political Theory, laying the groundwork for Swaraj. I guess it has just been 4 or 5 months. And he's also into that strand. So I'm not sure how this is going to be taken, because this is something which is very new, which talks of Swaraj in a more cosmopolitan way, rather than within the frontiers of national consciousness. Because in India, the problem has been that the notion of Swaraj has always been understood within the frontiers of national consciousness. And most often, even KCB, by philosophers, he has been understood as if he was trying to arise or a national consciousness rather than doing a humanist philosophy.
Sure.
And one comment, because I happen to teach philosophy rather than I'm a student of philosophy and I'm interested in contemporary Indian philosophy. Matilal, when he talks of ethics and epics, he argues that, it's just a comment, he argues that he has this beautiful argument that the problem with epics is that they deal with the debates of moral dilemmas. But unfortunately, they lack, and the lack is that at the end, the moral dilemmas are swept by miracles. And it is...
Are what?
Miracle.
Miracles.
It's just that to end up the question of moral dilemmas, Mahabharata comes up with miracles. Okay? And it's there that he sees that philosophers can come in and start their discussions. And he laments that Indian philosophers have not done that. It is somehow similar to Bhikkhu Parekh's poetry of political philosophy. He says that there is poetry of philosophy in India, in one way or the other. Thank you.
We can stop.
I think we should restrict it because we don't have time. So
Okay, just a question. Okay, Savita, no, Rorty actually rejects philosophy. He rejects philosophy as a foundational discipline, and I wouldn't reject philosophy. I think it's an extremely important subject, which has been for all these years taught very unimaginatively, so it's not really. I mean, I hear Stephen just closing down its philosophy department and replacing it with theology. It is one of the finest departments. You know, my suggestion is if life is chaotic and unpredictable, then we have to, in a way, recognize this and also recognize that many of these dilemmas are really not solvable. You can only resolve them, and resolving them means a great deal of ingenuity, innovation and imagination. So my point is of uncritically immersing yourself in a tradition, and you're right, he was part of the nationalist discourse on Swaraj, and he did urge a return to tradition, but all of them did, including Vivekananda. So his lament is that we are so uncritically submerged in Western ideas that we're not even able to make an aesthetic intervention. In a way, the only creative, as I said, I'm just reading it, so it's just a potential project on the horizon, but even this whole discussion among philosophers on Maya is extremely interesting. So when Aurobindo says, what is a Maya? If Laurence Olivier plays Hamlet, Laurence Olivier plays Hamlet. I thought it was a very interesting kind of an intervention, but I'm not qualified to deal with it. Whereas, what is interesting is both KCB and Bimal Matilal are Kantians. They are immersed in the tradition. They probably knew the language, because I know no Kantian who doesn't know German. And they were equally immersed in the Indian tradition. They taught respect for other traditions. It's that we don't have a 10 commandments, so don't prioritize your obligations. Our obligations are multiple. And when obligations are five virtues, isn't it? Then in a way you would have to seek your own course through your own creativity. I think they're arguing for an unleashing of your creativity rather than passively pointing out the problem of being immersed in a tradition that had been politicized in the 19th century. It had been subjected to such unbearable politicization that it became vulgar. I think the complexities of the Vedantic tradition were swept under the carpet. It became a rallying cry for the nation. And today, I often wonder which Bollywood scriptwriter authors the Prime Minister's speeches. I mean, that whole notion of Mati Ki Saugandh, it sounded like some 1960s actor. But in a way, this hyper dialogue which is overtaking our public sphere today needs to be interrogated. What's the harm in saying that Imran Khan showed a certain elegance of mind when he said all these things? No, you can't say it will be unpatriotic. So life is not is or black and white. A large part of it is grey.
बहुत शुक्रिया। पहले सत्र इस उद्घाटन सत्र के अंत में जहां प्रोफेसर चंदोक ने अपनी बात खत्म की है उस पर वापस ध्यान ले जाना ज़रूरी है और वह उस माहौल की चर्चा है जिसमें यह कॉन्फ्रेंस हो रही है और वह माहौल है भारत और पाकिस्तान के बीच युद्ध के छिड़ने की वास्तविक आशंका और इसलिए अकादमिक सेमिनारों में जो नहीं किया जाता है और इस सेमिनार के उस अर्थ में अकादमिक होने का कोई दावा नहीं है जिसमें अकादमिक का मतलब होता है कार्यान्वयन नहीं होना यानी सिर्फ चर्चा कराना। तो हम शुरू में एक प्रस्ताव पेश कर रहे हैं और वो प्रस्ताव युद्ध की आशंका को लेकर है। आपसे अनुरोध है कि आप ध्यान से सुनेंगे, अगर कोई परिवर्तन होगा तो आप सुझाएंगे, वरना अगर हम उसे स्वीकार करेंगे तो उस युद्ध के विरोध के साथ ही हम इस परिचर्चा को शुरू करेंगे। भारत और पाकिस्तान के बीच युद्ध की आशंका पर हम सब अपनी गहरी चिंता व्यक्त करते हैं। भारत के पायलट अभिनंदन की रिहाई के पाकिस्तान के फैसले से दोनों देशों के बीच संवाद की गुंजाइश बनी है। हम भारत सरकार से अपील करते हैं कि वह इस अवसर का पूरा उपयोग करे। आतंकवाद किसी भी तरह स्वीकार्य नहीं है, लेकिन कश्मीर की समस्या सिर्फ आतंकवाद विरोधी मुहिम से नहीं सुलझाई जा सकती। भारत और पाकिस्तान दोनों को ही इस मसले पर ईमानदारी और गंभीरता से चर्चा को आगे बढ़ाना चाहिए। साथ ही भारत को कश्मीर को एक राजनीतिक मसले के तौर पर समझना चाहिए, न कि सैन्य समस्या के तौर पर के रूप में। कश्मीर की जनता का भारत से अलगाव भारत के लिए एक चुनौती है जिसका सामना उसे करना है। दहशतगर्द समूहों का पाकिस्तान से सक्रिय रहना पाकिस्तान के लिए और पूरे उपमहाद्वीप के लिए एक बड़ी समस्या है। पाकिस्तान को भी उसे जल्दी से जल्दी समझना और सुलझाना जरूरी है। भारत का शासक दल अभी जिस तरह युद्ध का उन्माद पैदा कर रहा है और जिस तरह प्रधानमंत्री भी इसमें शामिल है, वह हमारे लिए फिक्र का विषय है। युद्ध से आतंक की समस्या नहीं सुलझती, यह इतिहास हमें बताता है। इसलिए भारत और पाकिस्तान दोनों के हित में संवाद फिर से शुरू करने के अलावा और कोई विकल्प नहीं है। ये प्रस्ताव आपके सामने है, अगर इसमें कोई परिवर्तन ना हो तो हम इसे स्वीकार मानेंगे।
Absolutely.
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। और इस सत्र की समाप्ति शुरुआत में अशोक वाजपेयी जी ने कविता पढ़ी थी श्रीकांत वर्मा की, और इसकी समाप्ति एक कविता से होगी जो विजय वे नारायण साई की कविता है, और इसका शीर्षक है बहस के बाद। असली सवाल यह है कि मुख्यमंत्री कौन होगा। नहीं, असली सवाल यह है कि ठाकुरों को इस बार कितने वोट मिले, कितने टिकट मिले। नहीं, असली सवाल यह है कि जिले से इस बार कितने मंत्री होंगे। नहीं, असली सवाल यह है कि गफूर का पत्ता कैसे कटा। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि जीप में पीछे कौन बैठा था। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि तराजू वाला कितना वोट काटेगा। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि मंत्री को राजदूत बनाना अपमान है या नहीं। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि मेरी साइकिल कौन ले गया। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि खूसट बुड्ढों को कब तक बर्दाश्त किया जाएगा। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि गैस कब तक मिलेगी। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि अमेरिका की सिट्टी पिट्टी गुम क्यों है। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि मेरी आंखों से दिखाई क्यों नहीं पड़ता। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि मुरलीधर बनता है या सचमुच उसकी पहुंच बहुत ऊपर तक है। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि पंडित जी का क्या होगा। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि सूखे का क्या हाल है। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि फौज क्या करेगी। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि क्या दाम नीचे आएंगे। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि मैं किसको पुकारूं। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि क्या यादवों में फूट पड़ेगी। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि शहर के 11 अफसर भूमिहार क्यों हो गए। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि बलात्कार के पीछे किसका हाथ था। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि इस बार शराब का ठेका किसे मिलेगा। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि दुश्मन नंबर 1 है। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि भुखमरी हुई या वह केवल प्रचार है। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि सभा में कितने आदमी थे। नहीं, असली सवाल है कि मेरे बच्चे चुप क्यों हो गए। नहीं, असली सवाल, सुनो भाई साधो, असली सवाल है कि असली सवाल क्या है। बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। हम आमंत्रित करते हैं आप सबको बहुत शुक्रिया सुनिया चंदो। तो हम आमंत्रित कर रहे हैं पहले सत्र अध्यक्ष मनीषा सेठी जी को और संजय श्रीवास्तव, वलय और इरफानुल्लाह फारूकी को कि वे मंच पर आए।
Thank you, Raza Foundation, Apurvanand ji, Maninder ji, for asking us to organize this panel and have a discussion on the question, is religion in crisis? That is the theme for this panel discussion today here. Since the theme of the conference is what is the question, I think we'll carry on with that spirit to raise more questions than to try and answer them all together here now. And I think in spirit of the theme, we will make no claims to having having found the truth or to make any of those claims. And one of the truth claims that I think was eroded well by 1960s, 70s was the idea that religion is going to decline and wither away with time. We know that religion is thriving and it sort of permeates almost everything, including state, polity, and so on. And originally, Apurvanand ji told me that the question that was framed for this panel was, is secularism in crisis? But it was changed to, is religion in crisis? So, but can we really think of secularism without thinking of religion? And can we think of religion without thinking of secularism? And can we, the increasing sort of, as Sabha Mahmood's work also shows how it's impossible really to think of one without the other, and where the claims of secularism now demand from religion itself that it sort of modify itself, transform itself and reform itself to be more commensurate with modern sensibilities and modes of governance and so on. So how do we look at religion in contemporary times? These are some of the questions that we have three very distinguished panelists today. We have Professor Sanjay Srivastav, who is a sociologist and whose book Untitled Urbanism you might be familiar with. He's been looking at urbanism and urban forms of religiosity for a very long time now, and he will be speaking on contemporary religious movements and trying to see the links between the rising consumer cultures and the kind of religiosities that are unfolding today. We have Irfanullah Farooqi, who teaches sociology at South Asian University, and we also have Wale Singh, whose wonderful book on Ayodhya, City of Faith, City of Discord is just out. So we look forward to a good discussion, and the format is that each of them will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion. Right? So, Sanjay, would you like to go first? They're saying you speak first.
Thank you. So, if you work in the present, it's almost impossible to be either intellectually coherent or eloquent, because of the as Neera ended her talk with talking about the contradictions that everyday life presents you with. So normally, if I have about 10 to 15 minutes, the approach I adopt, which justifies my lack of coherence, apparent lack of coherence.
No, you won't be incoherent at all.
It has to do with what I think is an implicit theorization that was pioneered by, I think, one of the greatest philosophers and greatest ignored philosophers in India was Rahul Sankrityayan, which is a Congresswala and a Buddhist and a communist and a libertarian and Gandhi and anti-Gandhi, and every time he would say that जब भी मैं कुछ बनता हूँ तो मुझको सवाल पूछने को मिलता है. So that's my only kind of justification for this presentation, which in 10, 15 minutes is difficult to think about. So I suppose my first response is really that the issue of the religion crisis. I don't think religion is in crisis at all, because that imagines, for me as a sociologist and anthropologist, there's an authentic way of being religious. I don't think there's any authentic way of being religious at all. So, and what I want to present to you is the manner in which religion, by focusing on what I refer to as new religious movements, and I think that is the most significant side in which we're looking at. We're trying to understand religion, spirituality, in trying to understand what has happened to religion right now. And the other thing is about secularism. Manisha is right. I think that in the Indian context as well, in particular, rather, we need to, it's in the same breath, whenever we speak of religion, almost by force of historical reason, we need to mention secularism, whether we agree with that manner in which it has been defined or not. And I think the problem is rather not the problem, but the instance that I'm going to illustrate to you suggests to me is that the notion of whether we can there's something called a secular imagination that can be promoted or not. My answer to that is no, not because I don't believe in it, but because I think what has happened in terms of new religious movements is a breaking down of the notion of something called a religiosity and non-religiosity. And I'll try and explain to you what I mean. And so it's not, my position is not like T.N. Madan's position that is not suited to Indian traditions, because I actually don't know what Indian traditions are anymore. It's really too late in the history of interaction between India and the West to think of something called an indigenous tradition we can rescue now. And frankly, I think it's a waste of time. But anyway, what I want to do here is look at new religious movements in order to kind of think about this question of religion, secularism, what's happened to religion. And I want to, so new religious movements, as you know, are kind of the spirituality-based movements that draw upon long existing religious contexts. So you may have, you have, for example, the Art of Living is a new religion movement, Dera Sacha Soda, the Isha Foundation. And one of the things, the two concepts I want to explore with you in this brief time that I have. One is the rise of, as Manisha mentioned, one of the things I want to talk about is the larger context of consumer culture within which religious belief is now embedded. So the two or three things I want to talk to you about. One is the notion of moral consumption, the rise of a notion of moral consumption, which is producing an idea of a moral middle class. And what does this mean in terms of what's happening to religion? And connected to that, the rise of also something that's linked to new religious movements and individualism, but an idea of collective individualism, which is, I think, something peculiar to our own context. That is to say, while people, and I can't go into the fieldwork that I'm basing this on, but there is a rise of a notion in individualism, but it's a notion of collective individualism. And that is to say that the whole idea of a neoliberal subject in India is, for me, is not a very useful term to use in Indian context, because while we have neoliberal processes in India, we actually don't have neoliberal subjects. Right? So you can have neoliberal processes, public-private partnerships, and governments giving things over to private players to build highways. We don't necessarily have neoliberal subjects. I think people are still embedded deeply in caste, kinship, other kinds of networks that don't make for something we understand as neoliberal subjects. So for me, these are some of the ideas I want to just preface my talk with. Okay. The second point I want to make is what has happened with new religious movements and why we need to think about this idea of crisis of religion more carefully, is that while in the secular tradition the idea of religion was thought of as containable, as a very specific realm, what has happened with the religious movements is the idea of the guru and the religious belief as completely uncontainable. So the guru can whether it's a man or a woman, is no longer only about religion. He or she can answer questions about finance, about relationships, about education, about a whole range of things. So the nature of large numbers of people who are attracted in religious movements is its uncontainability, and that kind of, for me, problematizes the older distinction between something called religion, religious belief, something called non-religious belief, and something called secularism. Because what has happened within this context of new religious movements, which I'll argue is also very significant part of consumer cultures, is this breaking down of this, the necessity for something a-religious, by which I'm sort of very loosely suggesting that a-religious doesn't mean you're non-religious, but it means the capacity to being secular, that you can be religious but also. So that's the kind of argument I'm making now. So my briefest example has to do with the Swaminarayan movement. Now, many of you have been to Akshardham temple here, perhaps, which belongs to the Swaminarayan, one particular sect of the Swaminarayan movement. This sect has become the global face of Hinduism in many ways. If you go to London, Europe, etc., there are famous Swaminarayan temples, and they're actually, in England, for example, one of the Swaminarayan temples was given the Indian Heritage Award, although it was only built about, 20 years ago. So Swaminarayan complex here on the banks of the Yamuna here was opened in 2005. I don't know I'm assuming you've been to Swaminarayan, many of you, since it's become such a significant tourist attraction. And I want to explore this idea of new religious movements, what's happened to religion, how we need to rethink how we look at religion rather than within the binary of religion, sort of communal and secular, but the manner in which the uncontainability of religious belief has blurred that distinction, so that we need to think about. So it's not so much that we have lost. Rather, it seems to me that we need to engage with everyday engagements with religion that are happening now. So Swaminarayan complex was opened here in 2005. If you enter, it was actually, the sons went to Disneyland and Universal Studios. So if you go to Swaminarayan complex, there is a huge, there's a boat ride into 10,000 years of Hindu civilization. On both sides, you'll see plastic surgery happening. You will see various kinds of things, and you can choose your commentary in Hindi or English. There are other attractions they can go to. There is an entire complex, a big hall, it's called Hall of Values, which has robotics displays. There's the life of Swaminarayan that is being, there are robots that sit down, stand up. There is a Bhagwan Swaminarayan, also known as Neelkant, who was giving discourse, turning people into vegetarians, and various scenes from his life are displayed. There's an IMAX theater, for example, which screens a film on the life of Swaminarayan, the founder. Swaminarayan sect was, of course, founded in the late 18th century. So the IMAX theater screens a film, the life of Swaminarayan, and this film is screened in different parts of the world. It's called Mystic India. There is a very large restaurant, which is like a vegetarian McDonald's, people wearing baseball caps which say Swaminarayan here. And so what is interesting for me, of course, is in the Akshardham context, is that it's a very specific manner in which certain ideas about religiosity and irreligiosity are produced. By irreligiosity, I don't mean non-religiosity, right? In the sense that in the same complex, you can be deeply religious, but it also offers you the capacity to move into a deeply consumed zone. Now, when I used the term moral consumption, spaces like Akshardham temple actually problematize our notions of what it is to be religious and non-religious by offering the capacity to be both at the same time. so that you can, there's a temple there, but you're also part of a very significant consumer culture. And the reason why this is important to think about is that what has happened is that the emergence of what I'm calling here a moral middle class, which distinguishes itself very significantly from an older middle class, kind of a Nehruvian middle class, which it argues is never able to come back to Indian traditions, however these traditions imagine. So you have a class now which imagines itself with the capacity to take part in both deep religious activities but also deeply consumerist activities, but also the capacity to both take part in consumerism but reject it and come back to Indian tradition when needed. So that model of new religious movement, which is there as part of Sri Ravi Shankar, which is part of Sadhguru Isha Foundation, various other kinds of new religious movements, actually problematizes, for me at least, destabilizes how we think about the distinction between being religious and what we have traditionally assumed to be the antithesis of religion, which is consumerism. Right? Because it is positioned so significantly within the context of consumerism itself, and so it offers both the question, what is the question? The question is it really, how Indian is it to be deeply consumerist? Right? Well, what do we do with Indian traditions if this is all Western thing? But it also offers the answer. The answer is that it is about choice. You can be both deeply consumerist but also deeply religious. So it offers, so increasingly I think that through this model of religion, there is a notion of a threshold identity. I don't think that there are the home in the world model that most in social sciences we are taught. Well, there's a home here which is about certain ideas of belonging, and there is a world that people deal with ideas in a certain way. I think increasingly what new religious movements have done is to produce a notion of threshold identities, the capacity, the proclivity for people to be able to move in multiple directions without experiencing the contradictions, in fact, that Neera was talking about. And that is why it's really important for us to engage with the manner in which consumer cultures in the current arena organize religion, because it allows people, because I think the very significant part is, it seems to me, is that people do not experience dilemmas the manner in which philosophers experience dilemmas. People do not experience contradictions the manner in which an analyst might see this as contradictory ways of being. So the making of a moral middle class, the making of moral consumption are really significant aspects in which some of these more academic ideas, more scholarly ideas about the relationship between religion, secularism, different kinds of identities might be engaged with. Now, so what I'm suggesting to you here is that the problem of this notion of secularism is not because we shouldn't be secular, the manner in which you understand secularism, but that for large numbers of people, if you're an ethnographer, even those who are not themselves communal, as we understand the term communal, is the lack of necessity for a term which is no longer relevant, because the lives that they lead allow them, as they experience it, to be both religious but also concurrently or simultaneously secular, in the sense that the consumer culture is something they experience as a secular life. Okay, so how do we then think about what is happening? How many? I have another 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. So so that's one thing. Now, so what I'm saying to religion has become the site for a number of other processes. It's become a site for thinking about class right now. What is the difference between sort of a new middle class and older middle class? And the most significant distinction that I'm suggesting to you is that new middle classness is imagined as a class identity which allows people, unlike the older Nehruvian middle class identity, is that it allows people to be both deeply, deeply global, but deeply, deeply Indian. And that indeed is the attraction of Narendra Modi. He offers you both the world, but also the continuing hold of the male figure over the family, over Indian traditions, etc., etc. Okay. So what I'm suggesting to you again is that it's when we talk about micropolitics, ethnography, and fieldwork, that there are certain ways in which we should try and link what happens in people's everyday lives with the broader political changes, political discourses, and the attractions to certain political discourses. Now, my second and final example is that of moral consumption is that For example, if you look at about 300 cities across India, there are gated communities that are being built, right? And they are one of the most significant sites of religious efflorescence. If you go to gated communities, the most significant religious functions on a very daily and regular basis are actually within gated communities, because RWAs organize them. There are the resources, and people take part of them with sort of renewed vigor, and also what happens here is that many of the religious so-called localized religious functions have become global, because, for example, in Gurgaon, many gated communities, many of the Janmashtami festivals are now done by ISKCON, right? So it links sort of the idea of a very localized tradition to a global Hinduism. Now, so the other context I think we should be thinking about is that is the notion again of a moral middle class and moral consumption, because within gated communities you have as in Akshardham temple, something quite interesting that's happening, which I think should force us to think about some of these ideas around the relationship in religion, secularism, and the everyday life of these terms, rather than beyond this hall here. What is the everyday life of this term? How do people engage with this? So in gated communities, as Akshardham, for example, women take part very strongly in religious context. In fact, one of the interesting things about Akshardham is that I've never seen so many women-only groups, right? And it is a public space in many ways, not like a street, but certainly a public space. So what happens in both Akshardham and gated communities is the renewed vigor with which women take part in religious activities as simultaneously that they take part in consumerism. So one of the other things that's happened to I think when we're thinking about religion and the relationship in religion and non-religiosity and irreligiosity is the question of gender, which is actually very significant when we are trying to think about what's happening in religion. So at Akshardham as well, you have women who take part in consumerist activities. Within a gated community as well, you have women who take part in consumerist activities. But simultaneously, these are also spaces where women take part in deeply religious activities. So one of the things that's happened in our public religion is the manner in which consumer culture has offered this notion of choice. That is, that women can be both consumers because they are able to come back to tradition. Now, the reason why that's important to think about is that historically, within our popular discourses and cultural traditions, the notion of woman as a consumer has a very problematic position, right? Because it's always been about woman as a sacrificer, literally consuming after the man. So, what has happened in the current context, and why the older secular, non-secular binary has broken down within consumer cultures, is because consumer cultures offer certain ways, a certain kind of, I'll even call it a certain personal politics for many people to engage with, and this is not a popular position because we normally dismiss consumer culture as something as a shallow effect. But in terms of gender, I think what's happened here is that both at Akshardham as in gated communities, consumer cultures offer certain ways of being, here I'm pointing both to men and women, particularly to women, whereby the older ideas of a threat to Indian tradition where women become consumers is done away with, because consumer cultures offer that choice, that you can both be a deeply religious person. So Karwa Chauth is one of the biggest festivals that in gated communities, and yet the morning after the night when women perform Karwa Chauth, the next morning you see them wearing skin hugging clothing and walking around and taking part in the different aspects of global consumer culture. So what has happened here, I think, through new religious movements, through new urban developments, is the breaking down of that older binary, or the lack of travel, but that we had hoped. By we, I mean, people who think that people should become more secular in the good sense. That I think that travel is not happening because other quotidian models of dealing with religion and irreligiosity have arisen, and that have to do with consumer cultures. Consumer cultures now provide the option of being both deeply religious but deeply irreligious. that older model that within theory, within analysis, used to be thought of as the distinction between being religious and being secular. So how do we actually deal with this? How do we deal with this rather than shy away from it by dismissing consumer culture as merely surface effects? And I guess my final question would be, in terms of this discussion on religion and secularism, is that we often tend to think religious and secular identity as deep identities. Okay. What would be lost in saying that in fact most of our identities are actually surface identities? I mean, what would be the problem? Whether it's through anthropology, sociology, and philosophy, we normally analyze what are referred to as deep identities. What would be lost is saying is that what we really require, I say this because there's also a workshop happening right now, what we could just as well live with is not so much deep diversity, but just shallow diversity. That's all what would be actually lost if we were to say that in fact the manner in which people engage with the world is through levels of shallowness, level of surface, and that is the level at which, when we are thinking about so-called progressive thought, we might also aim at. That we might also think of how consumer culture forms certain identities, and how do we then work through consumer culture to, as it were, influence the formation of other kinds of identities.
Thank you, Sanjay, very much. Sanjay makes this point of connecting religion with the idea of class, and one of the things that many scholars have pointed out is the rise of the Hindutva movement alongside the rise of neoliberal economics. And if there's one site that kind of signifies the rise of Hindutva, that's Ayodhya. And maybe we can now ask Valay to speak on his his experience of writing about Ayodhya, because he does a wonderful job of really peeling away the layers of history of Ayodhya as we know today, and he brings into his book how Ayodhya is, the multiple layers of history of Ayodhya, from being a Buddhist city to a Shaivite city, and then a Vaishnavite city, and what is happening here. Yeah.
Thank you, Manisha. I am essentially a journalist by training, and I am feeling a bit intimidated in the company of all you scholars and academics. But I'll try to do my best and bring to forefront what I discovered through my research on Ayodhya. The research was through secondary material as well as multiple visits to Ayodhya over a period of almost 2 years, 1.5 to 2 years. But the question that is posed to the panel is religion in crisis. So I would like to start with a short anecdote. I mean, when I asked my father, who's quite a religious person, he immediately said that religion is not in crisis. He doesn't believe so. What seems to be, how it is perceived to be in crisis could be through multiple ways, and there I agree with him. Because I interviewed a lot of people on the right wing who believe that Hinduism is in danger. To them, that's a crisis. Now, that is a dimension of it which is linked to the notion of there's a population explosion of Muslims, and if we do not do something about it, our own country, our own religion will be in some sort of existential danger. So that is one dimension of what we can say a kind of crisis. To the Vedic Hindu, the sort that my father is, the Hindus have gone astray, or even if this were to apply to most religions, people have gone astray from the true path or from the essence of what religion was supposed to be. The other dimension could be that how could we even think that religion is in crisis, because people do not say, oh my doctor, or oh my, there is still a faith in something in the unknown, which comes out as this God phenomenon. So we still rely very much on God, and so in that sense, religion is not in crisis. In the context of Ayodhya, because it lies in a region which is replete with archaeological evidence and of ancient civilizations, it is no surprise that the history of Ayodhya goes back to by the latest surveys to about 1300 BC, 3300 BC, sorry. So in that sense, Ayodhya is full of layers. The layers that people before me, historians, have discovered, the Buddhism, the Jainism, and of course the Hindu part of it. They all existed simultaneously in Ayodhya. But today, as we all know, it is only the Hindu aspect of it which is always highlighted, and the other layers of Ayodhya are being very consciously kind of covered up. So, I also, in the context of the research for the book, that I found that the one is the archaeological, the historical evidence of Ayodhya and what it was and how its trajectory has been. The other is the epic Ramayana. Now, I think the crisis about anything or in any sphere is always linked to ignorance. So there is a deep ignorance among general Hindus about the Ramayana itself. For example, a lot of people will not know that the Tulsidas Ramayana is not the Ramayana that was written by Valmiki. A lot of people will not know that a lot of, let's say, incidents that are present in the Valmiki Ramayana are not present in the Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas, and vice versa. So, should we even expect the common lay public to know those kind of changes that occur in epics and through a religion's own history, or should we just let it be and let today's godmen use the Ramayana template, as I discovered, in elections in Chhattisgarh, and use so the texts have been manipulated to further one's own agenda forever, but the common public, the point was the common public does not know the plurality of the Ramayana tradition. There is a whole bunch of Jain Ramayans, which are, some of them are in fact older than the Tulsidas Ramayana, and they openly mock the belief systems and the stories that are part of the Valmiki Ramayana. If anybody wants a reference, one thing could be looked up is the Hemchand's Ramayana. So that is the plurality of the Ramayana tradition. There is a Bengali Ramayana, there is an Assamese Ramayana, there is of course the Tamil Ramayana, and then there are the several Gond and there are tribes in Orissa, there are other tribes in central India. There is a bunch of Ramayans which show to even somebody like me who doesn't have a academic background in history or sociology or anthropology or anything like that, that the Ramayana as an epic has been used by the Vaishnava tradition to expand into regions like Christianity was taken to the uncivilized. Similarly, the Ramayana was used to preach the Vaishnava tradition to the uncivilized within India. And so this is a critical aspect that I think we all need to acknowledge, and especially the people who worship and who believe in the Vaishnava tradition or a larger Hindu tradition. This is another aspect that I learned about while researching Ayodhya. The other thing itself is that very few people realize how Ayodhya became a center of Ram worship quite late in history. It wasn't such a big center of Vaishnava worship. There is references in the Vaishnava sectarian literature which says that अगर मतलब कोई शहर में अपना तिलक करने के पहले 4 वैष्णवों को नहीं मारा तो वो तिलक नहीं करता था. So the snake and mongoose relationship between Shaiva and Vaishnavas is not such an old thing. It's maybe 400 years or 350, 400 years. The whole akhada system of we know the akhada is almost like a ritual. Every time there's kumbh and we see those babas and pictures, and we see it from a gaze that could be said to be essentially an Oriental or the gaze of the Western world. We don't know that the akhada system of Vaishnavas came into being to counter the akhada system of the Shaivites, and that it took place not too far from Delhi, near Jaipur in Kalta. We do not know, for example, that the Shaivite militias or armies were a critical part of the several late medieval empires in the north and northwest central India. There were armies these were militias that were siding with the British, they were siding with the Marathas, they were siding with the Awadh Nawab, and therefore in Ayodhya itself, the departure of the Shaivite armies was directly and indirectly a consequence of the British takeover of Awadh gradually. I mean, this happened before 1857. The Shaivite armies were kind of disbanded. Now, in our context, in the context of the panel discussion, the crisis in religion, I suppose, there's always been a crisis in religion. There has been no such time where there has been no crisis in any religion. So I suppose crisis is a sort of a consistent companion. But in the context of the Ayodhya, I keep coming back to it because that's all I kind of know. The Shaivites left, and it was almost as though they were never there. I mean, why? I think we need to ask, why do we not like to look back at our different histories? And we just want to wipe out the old and pretend as though nothing existed before that. So there were, even today, one of the most revered temples is called Nageshwarnath in Ayodhya. And there are other temples, there's one Hanuman temple, which is Hanuman Gadi. So I'm not going to the dispute around because I'm kind of wearing off, but I'm not going to the dispute around Ayodhya. But when the British came, and scholars have said this before, and I'm just referring without mentioning their names, the British found the concept of Vaishnava belief much more amenable to their own goals than the Shaivite system of kind of the militant Shaivite system of sannyasis. And therefore it can be said that the growth or explosion of Vaishnavism in North India was a result of the British takeover or gradual takeover of India. So therefore, if people knew this, I suppose they would think differently, is all I'm trying to say. But we do not know our own histories, our own religion's history and its own multiple sub-histories. And if we knew that, would it be a different scenario today? Again, for example, people do not realize that while these Shankaracharyas and godmen from outside try to meddle in the Ayodhya affair all the time, within Ayodhya there has always been a strong resistance to these godmen. They do not think of them as Hindus. They do not consider them as the true inheritors of the religion. They are not Sanatani, as it were. So while Professor Sanjay was alluding to the new religions, and he was talking about the Swaminarayan sect, interestingly, when I was in Ayodhya, I heard from a lot of old-timers that a lot of people have come out of Ayodhya. They could not, it was depressed, it was just suffocating for them. So in fact, the Swaminarayan sect was founded by a Brahmin who was born in a village near Ayodhya, which is called Chapia. And there are multiple examples of this, that people who try to who just thought differently could not survive in the, let's say, the constrictive spaces that mainstream Hindu religion kind of promotes. Because at the end of the day, I think we also need to realize how commodified and how commercialized religion has become over the years. It has always been. Mandirs have always been a space of contestation. But how many of the devout actually care about that? And how much have we done since we became a democracy to kind of deal with this problem, this ignorance of the masses? I think the onus also lies on people like us to enlighten the devout, tell them, break it down and put it in front of them to see that what is religion. And therefore that is linked to the Reformation in Ayodhya or in India itself among different religions. Is there any Reformation happening? We reform everything, our medical, everything, but in religion, is religion a very completely stagnant thing? And if that is so, who is going to question that? That, I think, if we think that there is a crisis in religion, I think we have to link it with how stagnant a stinking pool of dead ideas religion has become. And so that is also linked to crisis in religion. I think I'm almost done, Manisha, but I do want to mention the fact that for Ayodhya itself, very few people except scholars would know was a center of Sufi learning. There was Amir Khusro, this Badi Bua, Chirag Dilli, his family is in Ayodhya, his grave is still there, either his grave or his birthplace is marked there. And that tradition also needs to be brought out, not just in the context of Ayodhya, but overall. So we need to, I think, try and go back to the multiple identities, as Professor Srivastava just said, and try to, be conscious of them. But at the same time, I was thinking, Professor Srivastava, when you said that we have superficial identities, and I was thinking that we, and maybe being Indian was a superficial identity for a lot of people. It never really permeated in their, they never really internalized it. And all the other identities were always sort of simmering under the surface. And in the last few years, we've seen that there is a increasing identity-based assertion. And not just in terms of Hindus and Muslims, we have seen that in terms of castes, upper caste, lower caste, and regions. So we might have different identities, but which is that one identity which will ensure our own, for lack of a better word, upward mobilization or gaining more power and strength in every way. So we are opportunistic, I suppose, and we will go with the identity that gets us the most benefits or most, that power. And today's Ayodhya, I would like to just say that for most Babas and most want-to-be Babas, young boys, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, just zooming off on bikes all the time, wearing earphones, want the latest phones. They have the common aspirations of a late teenager or an early youth, and they want to use religion to get material benefits. I did not come across too many people who were actually, maybe because the nature of actual sort of pursuit of peace or spirituality, people don't really want to talk too much about it. And the masses of the Ayodhya Babas are just after material gain. And they would happily use religion to accrue material benefits for themselves. And is that necessarily wrong when everything else also stands commercialized? And I think that is the question I would leave us all with. Stop here.
Thank you, Bale. Now I'd invite Irfanullah Farooqi to speak.
Yeah, thank you. My presentation, views, as it were, this is very tentative. This is something that's more in the making. So I am primarily, I'm looking at religious looks and when religious looks matter and what kind of a performative anxiety does that lead to. So there are a few things that I have to say, and rather than understanding this, my attempt is essentially to misunderstand it better, if at all that's possible. So I start with this very important question, how are religious looks perceived in secular polities? Do symbols such as beard, skull cap and veil only demonstrate an identity, or they camouflage other identities? In a polity and culture reasonably skeptical towards religiosity due to reasons of various kinds, is religious appearance also, more often than not, accompanied by a perpetual quest for approval and acceptance? In the next 10 to 15 minutes, I want to engage with these questions in the larger context of Muslim men and women who sport religious looks, alongside cherishing deep allegiance to secular ethos. I'm interested in exploring how, in the case of Muslims in particular, the simultaneity of religious appearance and secular worldview, a possibility offered by Indian secularism to an extent, leads to an anxiety that often pushes the subject to conduct herself in a way that invites approval or acceptance. The anxiety is about the likelihood of being subjected to deviant and ill-informed curiosity. Under the weight of this anxiety that demands perpetual performance, religiously inclined Muslims, equally attentive to the demands of a secular worldview, find it difficult to conduct themselves in a natural way. So before I have few examples, and on the basis of these examples, I have few arguments to offer. But before I go into this, I would just want to set the stage. So I go back to a very important moment in colonial India. I was requested by the chair, and I think it's important to set the stage that way. So I want to go back to some of the arguments that are presented by Iqbal in various lectures of his, that essentially look at the need for a certain kind of cultural milieu vis-a-vis minorities, particularly Muslims. So cultural rights essentially, and I think that should help us in understanding the questions that I want to pose. So this landscape is important because when we go back to our past and references from the past, they help us make sense of the present predicaments. Iqbal, someone I referred to, is referred to in several ways. And given his layered and complex personality, there is significant scope in approaching him from diverse vantage points. Much to our misfortune, Iqbal is usually referred to, for the most part, usually referred to with respect to the Allahabad December 1930 address, the presidential address. A speech that is more often than not considered an event and not an outcome of an uncommonly perceptive engagement with religion as, and I quote Iqbal, the main principle that should determine the general character of political decisions. So there are various articles, there are various speeches of his. So for instance, right after his return from Europe in 1908, at least 3 lectures that I can refer to. One is sociological study of Muslim community, the moral and ethical dimension of Islam, political thought in Islam. So these are 3 lectures that are particularly to be, major chunks of the 1930 address can actually be traced back to these 3 lectures that were delivered right after 1908 till 1911. While there is no denying that Iqbal extensively responded to what he saw as crisis of religion in his 1930 address, most of the concerns raised by him can be traced back to several other insightful speeches of his delivered much before. As the chief formative factor in the life history of Muslims in India, Islam, according to Iqbal, could work at its best in India because it could work here as a culture. It is by emphasizing on the cultural logic of a religion like Islam that Iqbal denounced the erstwhile Congress politics in which the religious attitude was not allowed to play any part. He ardently advocated each group's right to free and full development according to its own cultural traditions, something he calls in his address the higher aspect of communalism. In that respect, he vehemently criticized conception and case of a unity that was sought in the negation instead of mutual cooperation and cooperation of the many. Pitching Islam as a culture, Iqbal invoked a community's right to retain its private individuality, looking at the Indian problem not from the standpoint of Muslims, but Indian Muslims. The permanent solution, quote unquote, of the communal problem that he proposed was to him in the interest of both, as we all know, India and Islam. To quote him, the object of religion is not thinking about life. Its main purpose is to build up a coherent social whole for the gradual elevation of life. Mere belief will not do. Another quote, in order to become a living member of the Muslim community, the individual, besides an unconditional belief in the religious principle, must thoroughly assimilate the culture of the religion, that is Islam. These observations can instantly be understood with reference to Iqbal's lifelong occupation with the paramount significance of development of personality in man's mortal existence. Man to him was not a thing to be exploited, but a personality to be developed. That said, his words also hint at the crisis of religion at that point, as a result of which Indian Muslim, deprived of a cultural apparatus, was to be deprived of exploring the depths of her own inner life. It is in this respect that one is able to make sense of Iqbal's words in his 1932 presidential address, which is kind of the last public address delivered at the All India Muslim Conference, wherein he says towards the end, future programs should therefore be partly political and partly cultural. Now, not just Iqbal, but just passingly, I mean, because for the most part we think that, Iqbal and Jinnah belong to one camp and people like Maulana Muhammad Ali Jawhar and Abul Kalam Azad belong to another. And there's a problem with that binary, but I won't go into the details of it. But even people like Maulana Muhammad Ali Jawhar and Abul Kalam Azad at various points in time were actually making a case for cultural rights. So for instance, in a famous piece of his communal representation where Maulana Muhammad Ali Jawhar has actually went ahead and critiqued the communal representation bit, he has also flagged his concern vis-a-vis the Hindu community not agreeing to the demands that are raised by the Muslim community. So while he goes against the communal representation bit, he nevertheless also flags that there's something disturbingly concerning about one community not necessarily willing to listen to another community. Similarly, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, because of course Azad lived much longer, I mean he saw a lot of things that Jawhar did not. When he goes to Aligarh, when he's in Jama Masjid, he's again and again talking to Muslims, and one of the things that he's insisting on is that in this independent India, you will have right to live the way you want to, right? So again, going back to Islam as a way of life and not necessarily just a religion. Coming back to, so with this as the background to come to the contemporary, I mean, how do I look at this performative anxiety on the part of people who, look like Muslims, who have a certain look that they carry? I don't want to get into some of the things that we've already discussed. For instance, I mean, we've read about this. So madrasas playing national anthem, national flag being hoisted, on the premises of various minority institutions, iftar parties where you open your fast with cow milk. I mean, these are things that we've already discussed, and enough has been reflected on this. I actually want to look at how there is a certain conduct that comes into being as a result of a certain anxiety. And I want to give two examples. So one is an example from this morning. So I was coming with another participant, and we were in this cab, and I was telling this friend of mine that, so this friend of mine asked me that, okay, who all are there in this panel discussion? So I told him that there's Professor Sanjay Srivastava. He's going to talk about new religious movements. And then I told him that there is this journalist named Mr. Valay, and I did not tell him what is it that Valay is going to speak about. Right now, and the reason for this is, and one could actually one could make sense of this in various ways, but this is the way in which I look at it. Because there's a cab driver, and there's a certain name. I have a certain name, I have a certain appearance, and there's so much that goes into it. So it happens before the fraction of a second. But there's so much that goes into that strategic silence on my part. So that's one example. The other example is not that recent. I boarded Delhi Metro, and as it happens, I mean, kids in India have, wonderful ways of making their presence felt in public spaces. So there was this kid who was crying left, right, and center without giving a damn to what people were thinking. So I was standing a little away from the kid, and to my understanding, the family was lower middle class. Again, I'm going by the appearance logic here, but lower middle class. So very everyday family. And this mother, so she looks at me, and we're not very far from each other. So she looks at me, and she tells this child, who's about 3 years old, she tells this child, "Baba khade hain, Baba ko dekho." So of course, this is not the Baba that Valay is referring to. I mean, those of us, I think some of us can actually connect with this, because when we were kids, we were very often told by our mothers, particularly mothers, because father himself was a Baba. He would just beat us, and things would be taken care of then and there, but mother would invariably invoke this Baba. And thankfully we never met this Baba. So there was a certain disturbingly racist understanding. So this was of course very black, ugly person. But this Baba thing that was invoked in Delhi Metro actually also urged me to think about some of the ways in which, to go back to what Professor Srivastava was arguing, just to sort of extend on that. It is not, I mean, while there's something distinctly perceptive about this idea that religious identity, our affiliation with religion, or for that matter secularism, is very, very tentative. I mean, it's not very deep. But I suppose what we are equally interested in, there's something about the ways in which religious identities are perceived. And unfortunately, there is something deep about these perceptions. So I, of course, know that my association with the religion is not really that rooted in that sense. I mean, I sort of, maybe I violate things left, right, and center. But at the same time, I'm also aware that there's a way in which I'm perceived as a member of a particular religious movement. And I think there's nothing tentative about it. So we could perhaps look into this as well. So, how does one conduct oneself when one is understood in advance? That is the question. In any public space, how is one to behave knowing very well that he or she has already been understood? How is one to engage with very often becoming a source of, at times momentary and at times disconcertingly prolonged unease? The violence implicit in this is to be understood in terms of denial of conversation. The only option that the person has, in my opinion, is in terms of behaving unnecessarily well behaved. Instant utterance of sorry, uncommonly diligent response to excuse me, and so on. So as to ward off, to go back to something that I said in the beginning, unwarranted curiosity. Though stated earlier, I must qualify my views by stating that this anxiety is in the case of those who carry a Muslim look and are moderate in terms of their outlook in things, because this query also has a certain privileged location to it. So I am able to think about it in a certain way, or people I have interacted with, or in general conversations. This has actually come out of a group that is, of course, privileged, right, that can afford to think about it. Essentially those who would want to bask in the promise of meaningful conversations and earnest exchange of ideas. They feel violated. I speak with the awareness that I speak on behalf of privileged lot, for there is a significant population of the same community in India who live with this denial vis-a-vis an earnest engage without, on occasions, even knowing it. Since they don't know, there's not much of an anxiety on their part. I mean, their anxiety is of a completely different nature. I'm no one to demean that, but just to get this clear. As it is on those, so the anxiety on their part is of a different kind, as compared to on the part of those educated in universities and made to believe in the power of ideas and critical thinking. The anxiety is also to be understood in terms of their helplessness, in terms of how their identity, constructed on the basis of the looks they carry, camouflages several other identities of theirs. They are not afforded the privilege to raise the concern the way several liberal Muslims can easily express their worry when they are told they don't look Muslim. So there is an interesting question that people ask few people, that they don't look Muslim. Now my question is that can someone I am concerned with ask a question of a different kind, that they don't look secular? Because how is it that one were to engage with a secular look? What is a secular look? The lot I am concerned never faces this element of surprise articulated through, oh, but you don't look secular. For something of this sort to happen, one has to be invited to or considered worthy of a conversation. I particularly find this recent development unsettling because, I've been part of a generation, I think there's no uniqueness to my case. I think we were all growing up in the 80s, most of us, and I distinctly remember this, and I'm coming to the conclusion bit. I distinctly remember this, that, every Sunday, and I wouldn't recite the Quran throughout the week, but every Sunday in the morning, we would recite the Quran just to watch Ramayana. Because it was a certain bargain that would happen within the families. And of course, we didn't have television back then, so we would all gather in a house in the neighborhood. But Ramayana would invariably, one could read this through different vantage points, but I am simply interested in a certain kind of upbringing. We consume good and the evil, completely oblivious of another narrative of good and evil gaining roots in the country at that point of time. So when I think about this anxiety, I am urged to tell myself that much of it has to do with the absence of a cultural will that permits us to engage with religion as a source of meaning and not simply an ideology. I'm going back to Ashish Nandi's famous intervention in the context of secularism. This absence is leading to a vacuum, as a result of which minorities have no other option but to get shaped in the image of the dominant. Since we are for the most part, to borrow from T. N. Madan, the weakness of religion is invoked as opposed to its strength. We refuse to entertain the possibility of an environment where it can be an absolute value as an absolute value constitutive of social life. To conclude, in his perceptive analysis of secularism's doings in India, Nandi placed at the bottom of the hierarchy those who are believers in both private and public. As one gets a little ashamed of our religious beliefs, we might want to pause for a while and think about where secularization as a process and not as a thesis has gone wrong. At a time when India is in news for rising intolerance, lynching, communal violence, and a disturbing pervasiveness of populism that has, much to our surprise, found a sizable audience across the country, an inquiry of this nature addresses the crisis in the domain of understanding the contours of religion and helps us make sense of the negotiations undertaken by identities as they chart their journeys. At a time when religion-based violence has become rampant, it is obligatory on our part to reclaim the religious. I say this because anyone with supposedly religious looks should not be denied a conversation. Our faces should not rest our case. As a Muslim with a liberal outlook, one should genuinely believe in her freedom to carry a religiosity that refuses to be assessed by shallow standards of compatibility. I do not want my ability to think and question to be limited to my response to ISIS, Taliban's cartoon controversy, executions in the Middle East, and so on. There is a pressing need to say no to a call that commands a specific kind of religiosity. We must not pay heed to that command and celebrate the sheer complexity everything acquires the moment it is touched by the human. Thank you.
Thank you, Irfan. I was reminded of Veena Das's comment that religious subjectivities are often forged in the context of religious pluralism, but that this pluralism may also be, a site of prejudices, perceptions, and as you say, advanced understanding, which actually clog off all possibilities of a dialogue. So, how much time do we have? We are running a little late, so maybe we have 15 minutes. Okay. So we can have a few questions, but I would really request you all not to make mini presentations and to ask really, pointed questions, please. Please identify yourself and then ask your question.
I'm Dhananjay and I teach at Central University of Gujarat, Gandhinagar. And this is to Professor Sanjay and Swaminarayan. And I would suggest, if I look at them, I do look at Swaminarayan and all three sects of Swaminarayan, original Swaminarayan, Bab Swaminarayan and Maninagar Swaminarayan. This part, the religious and consumerism, is a part of Hindu political. And if we look at Hindu political, binaries are being created. Even this consumerism is not secular consumerism. It is a very much vegetarian consumerism or Hindu political consumerism. One thing. And secondly, if you look at closely the content of consumerism at Babs, I would suggest following things. For example, there is a eugenic projects by Akhil Bharatiya Pratinithi Sabha, apex body of RSS in Ahmedabad, and many people from Swadhyay and Swaminarayan, particularly women, and they would account for 80% to 90%. Those who are participating as a religious creed and also consumerist creed would participate, and their number would be 20,000 for the arrival of new Aryans, and the number would be 20,000 in some 2-3 years. So I suggest that this religious and irreligious in context of Swaminarayan is, I think, not tenable, because head of Swaminarayan was also the member of International Board of Vishwa Hindu Parishad, who died 2 years back.
We can take some couple of, yes ma'am, please.
I have one short question to Sanjay and another to Ajodhya. You said that women have Modernity. I also deal with culture and all those things. Now, the question to you is regarding Sabarimala. If you analyze Sabarimala, then women cannot be free, free to be consumer and then yet get out of the fold of tradition. Even if they do, the society doesn't permit them. How do we resolve that contradiction? Now, two things. You said that Vaisnavites did spread the idea of Brahman, but their ideas are very egalitarian ideas. They challenge patriarchy, caste, whereas Brahman is just opposite. How could they match these two things? And another piece of information I would like to share with you. In Odia, there's a Ramayana called Vilanka Ramayana, where Sita challenges Rama. Instead of getting littering to fire, she challenges and says that you did not kill Ravana. It's me who killed Ravana. And she proved that in another case. Thank you.
Any questions? Yeah.
My name is Praveen Priyadarshi, and my question is to Professor Sanjay Srivastava. I completely agree with the kind of shared space that you have talked about. Spaces such as temple being a shared space for both for consumerism and religiosity. But I mean, to what extent can we actually relate this with just the new religious movements, new religious practices? Anecdotally, I'm thinking about, say, for example, I come across I can't imagine a temple which also does not have a toy shop, just outside. Also, sort of practice of Tirthatan also has certain amount of, kind of, element of fun to it. So religion has been, understood as, it has an element of renunciation, but it also has, various religions also tell us how to basically consume. There are codes under which one can consume. So I'm just asked, basically my question is about this binary that you are posing.
One last question if anybody has. Yes.
बोलिए माइक नजदीक लाइए.
जगह का माइक का अपना मामला होता है.
ठीक है, आप इधर ऐसे ऊंचा बोल लीजिए. क्या
2 मिनट समय लूँगा. मैं एसडीएफ कॉलोनी में जाता था ट्यूशन पढ़ाने. तो ट्यूशन पढ़ा रहा था तो एक मजदूर था, वो उसी घर में जिसमें मैं पढ़ा रहा था. तो वो अगले दिन उसको काम करने आना था. तो उसने नंबर अपना दिया उस मालिक को. तो उसने बोला कि मेरा नाम अजय है. तो उस मकान मालकिन ने कहा कि अजय नाम आप पे शूट नहीं करता है. वो मजदूर था, काला दिख रहा था. तो मुझे बुरा लगा थोड़ा देखने में कि अजय नाम इस पर क्यों शूट नहीं कर सकता. तो फिर वो चला गया. तो वो मैम बोली कि सर पता है मैंने इसको क्यों बोला. इसने जब अपना नंबर दिया तो ट्रू कॉलर पे मैंने डाला तो इसका नाम मोहम्मद सलीम बताया. तो फिर उस मैम ने ही बताया कि इन सारी चीज़ों के बारे में. तो मतलब मुद्दे पे आता हुआ, मतलब दिल्ली में ये है कि बहुत सारे मुस्लिम जो मजदूर हैं उनको लोग वो आइडेंटिटी छिपा करके यहाँ पे काम करते हैं. और उसके बाद क्या है, मैं बहुत जगह ऐसे जगह पे गया, जैसे मुनीरका हो गया, पुरानी दिल्ली, जहाँ पे मजदूर बैठते हैं काम के लिए. वहाँ जगह मैंने पूछा उन लोगों से, पड़ताल की, तो वहाँ पर ये मुद्दा सामने आया कि अगर वो लोग जान लेते हैं कि इसका नाम सलीम है, ये है, वो है, तो वो लोग रखते नहीं है. और बहुत बार तो कुछ केसेस में ऐसा, मेरी डायरी में सारा नोट है इंट्रोडक्शन के साथ, बहुत लोग ऐसे हैं कि मतलब उनको बीच काम में पता चले गया ना कि ये है, तो उसको मतलब बीच काम से उनको हटा दिया गया. तो मैंने उन लोगों से वादा किया था कि आप लोगों के इस मुद्दे को मैं ज़रूर अच्छी जगह पे उठाऊंगा. तो इस संदर्भ में मुझे लगता है कि ये कुछ राय रखनी चाहिए.
जी शुक्रिया.